The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, welcoming you back to the very last of these lectures on the planets, the second half of the last movement, Neptune the Mystic, by Gustav Holst. If you haven't watched part 1, I really recommend strongly that you go do that, because there is a lot of context there that I don't want to just keep repeating over and over again, which will make it very boring for the people who've already watched that and are probably just binge watching this series and are ready to move on. So go ahead and watch that. So you'll see some elements of juxtaposed harmony with an implied minor in the bass and a different minor chord over that, sometimes switching back and forth. You'll see interlocking or intersecting arcs, as we see here in these glissandi between the two harps, and so on. You'll see other textural elements as well. Okay, so I'm just going to presume that you've watched all that, and let's move straight back into this analysis. As we did before, let's examine the textural elements, or the background elements, before we examine the foreground elements. Because this movement is really about texture more than it is about motive or soloing. We see the entrance of the organ pedals, just playing a low A flat there, doubled by the double basses, and of course the juxtaposition of this A flat minor is E minor, which we see in unmeasured tremolo. There's a very cool effect here, sul ponticello, so the strings are playing close to the bridge and they're having more of a trebly sound, and possibly even hearing some overtones above that. But the cool effect is not just the sul ponticello, but it's the enclosure of the seconds by the firsts. This is a trick that I actually use a lot, and that is to give the double stops to the first violins and to have the second violins play a note in the middle of that double stop. And it's a really good way of voicing a chord because it unifies the upper strings quite nicely, especially if the violins would be sitting on either side of the stage, right, with the first violins on the left and the second violins on the right, on either side of the conductor. That will make the chord feel like it's coming from all the strings at once, rather than just being lopsided, one on one side and the other on the other. It's really not the biggest concern in harmony, but you saw composers playing around with the idea, like Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony in his last movement trades off a theme between the firsts and the seconds, and that was for his enjoyment as a conductor, so that he could hear the melody shift from side to side of him as he conducted. But all that aside, it's just more reliable to have the firsts play the double stops and the seconds take up a harmonic position inside them. It's just easier to navigate, it's easier to tune, and so on. And especially with these lower pitches, where it would be harder for the firsts to play a C third here and have the second violins just play the open G. This way, all the firsts have to do is just finger an E and play an open G, and then the seconds can play inside them. But even without those considerations, say the first violins were to rise and the second violins were to go along with them, I would still try to have them continue that strategy, because it's a pretty strong one. Now these strings are being doubled by bassoons and flute and bass flute, A2 on the flutes, notice. Bass flute is taking up the position of that open G, and notice that the substitution offered is clarinet there, which would work pretty well, I've got to say. This will make an intriguing sound if everybody is playing extremely softly. The first bassoon being enclosed by flute and bass flute. There can be a unifying sound here at a softer dynamic. And we've studied that there are relationships between flutes and bassoons, but usually that is the bassoon from below by an octave or two, and the flutes higher, right? So the overtones of the bassoons support the flutes, but here they're all playing together, and it's a sound that works really, really well behind these strings. And I also like the sense of sul ponticello, which will work in a positive way alongside the flutes and bassoons together in such a close, low combination for the flutes. Now let's talk about this foreground element here of the celesta. While everybody is just fluttering along here with this E minor tremolo over the A flat fifth, we've got the celesta playing what really sounds mysterious, but is extremely simple harmonically. It's basically just an E major arpeggio with little half-step lead-ins to the root and the third, right? So we're going D sharp E, F double sharp G sharp, then just a B, D sharp to E once again, F double sharp to G sharp, and a B, and so on. So that same harmonic ladder works its way down step by step. So it really sounds exotic and beautiful and charming, but it's not really all that mysterious, but interesting to put those chromatic sounds and the sense of E major over E minor, right? And have a kind of relationship between that very, very low rock bottom A flat and the major third here of G sharp, which are enharmonically the same. One other thing to point out about this celesta line, and that is that once again, it's an expression of the flexibility of this 5/4 time signature, and how Holst occasionally abandons the strict sense of meter. Here we have a 3 plus a 2. Then we just have little phrases of 3 beats, if you include the rest, ending with 2 rests and 2 beats. And I think that that's really great. It makes things feel really mysterious rhythmically. Also, the entire idea of throwing 5/4 there in the first place puts the audience off its guard and helps to keep its sense of expectation from being fulfilled all the time. Now let's move on to the second half of this screen. Beautiful, mysterious glissandos crossing each other here. And just continuing the sense of E minor above, with a little F sharp at the top of each of these arcs here. That's kind of nice. Continuing on, though, that same sense of A flat fifth or G sharp fifth and the bass. And actually quite emphasized here, really going all out with the lower winds and lower brass. Limited as it is, as you'll remember, there are no tubas in this particular movement. But yeah, the 3 trombones playing that G sharp octave and a fifth, and then an inversion of that in the 3 bassoons. But notice how the horns are playing a 6/4 E minor octave chord. Of course, here it's expressed as a B minor chord, but just think down a fifth, right? And there is a sole trumpet playing a little E at the top of that. Really saving up that one beautiful soft note. Remember that heavy brass and horns can play pianissimo just beautifully. I touched on that in the previous movement, and just remember that that sense of softness still cannot be as subtle as, say, flutes being extremely soft in their lower range, or strings. But it will still be really beautiful and controlled and lovely. Another thing to point out is that these perfectly tuned chords being held for long, long, long periods of time are really, really tough for brass players, especially very, very soft notes. That is something that just takes a lot of mastery and a lot of focus to get. It might be easier for a horn player to play a very fast rhythmic passage with lots of staccatos, as opposed to just this one long, long, long note. Especially for very low notes on horn. That's a tough one. Just to get perfect intonation on a very, very low note, very, very softly for a very long period of time. That's a tough one. Better to give it to the trombones if you need that kind of an effect. All the same, this is perfectly good writing, and it's the kind of thing that, most players could play really, really well, and you'll hear that in the recording too. It's just, generally speaking, it's pretty well tuned. The horn players fluff a note here or there in this particular recording, but considering the pressure that these young players are under, it's completely understandable. Interestingly enough, the English horn is doubling that high E in the trumpet. So it has a very, very beautiful, clear, soft sound if everybody is really listening to each other. So let's have a listen to this screen now and listen for all of those elements. Sometimes it's very hard in these recordings because it just depends on where the microphone is, how they are positioned, and how the conductor has balanced the orchestra. Some elements may not show up at all, and you'll have a really good recording that brings out certain things that you hadn't really heard before, but leaves others down in the texture, so it's almost imperceptible. And that's one of the things that is beautiful about a composition like this for a conductor. All the coloristic elements are there in the texture, and you can get different effects by emphasizing different instruments, by suppressing others, by letting things murmur rather than be more on the surface. It's just really a box of wonders. It's just so well orchestrated. And it's not like there is any one perfect way of doing this either. We saw that in the Stravinsky Rite of Spring orchestration studies that I released earlier this year. There are different ways of emphasizing different things in any great score like this that has so many subtleties and so many different colors. So think about that and try to listen to different versions of this work and see which color comes to the surface and which is in the background. So having said that, listen for this combination of brass and bassoons. And I just really love this low G sharp here. It's just phenomenal. It's so much fun. And also listen to the contrast between these two textures. One last thing I'd like to point out is here we're seeing a glissando, and it's very clear, up in 3 beats, down in 2. And that actually helps the musician read how many beats this is supposed to be, right? Because there's very little clue otherwise, right? There's no time value really separating these except for just what's written here in text. But Holst almost never uses glissandos in this piece at all. They're very, very rare. There's just a few instances here and there, and this is one of them. And you would think that in a piece like this, you would want to throw glissandos everywhere. But I really want to point this out if you are a developing orchestrator, is that you really don't need to put glissandos in. And in fact, they've become a total cliche. I mean, they were a cliche back in Holst's time, all right? Think of that. And have we learned anything in the past century? Apparently not. You still can work up an audience by throwing in that glissando, and they go with it, and they feel great, and then afterwards you can feel really cheap that you just threw that effect in there to just rile them up and to make them excited and so on. So try to hold off on the glissandos. Here, they are done in a completely non-cliched way, as a purely textural element rather than an emotional one. So please remember that. So yeah, so listen for this sort of arcing, throbbing kind of gesture in the violins and violas, and how that contrasts with the horns and heavy brass and bassoons, and also listen for the way that string tremolos and this combination of bassoons and low flutes works, especially with sul ponticello. And if you're really, really listening, see if you can make out that low organ pedal A flat and its relationship to this lonely celesta line. On this next page, notice the change in tempo, allegretto. This isn't hugely fast, and it isn't sprightly or anything. Things just move along a bit quicker. So it's a little allegro, but it really isn't fast. It's just in motion. Now this is extremely important, logistically, if nothing else. And I've actually heard conductors blow this by slowing down slightly. They'll start off and things will be flowing really nicely, and then when they get to this point and the music becomes more complex and there's this beautiful clarinet solo and so on, I've heard one or two recordings and performances where the conductor sort of slows down a little bit, almost as if they're a little afraid that they're going too fast. But that is not the time to slow the music down, because these poor sopranos are holding this long, long, long G here at pianissimo, and that takes some air to go for this long. Now, there are ways that you can sort of substitute bringing in other voices, but that's not really kosher. It's better just to have the same singer sing all the way through this, and even giving a bit of crescendo and diminuendo here. This is about as high as you would want to score a pianissimo note for a soprano anyways. I have worked with different singers trying to get like a really soft high A. That's really tough. I would say G is a good, dependable upper limit. You'll notice that in Holst's scoring is that he will figure out what is the best note for this particular dynamic, how far can I push this, and then he'll score that note, like we saw before. In the previous lecture, there was a high-written G flat for the horns at piano or pianissimo, and that's also about as high that you can go with horns and really get a true pianissimo for the horns, not necessarily for the entire orchestra, but still something that they can control in that very discreet way. Now that we've talked about the tempo and its ramifications for everybody else, especially the poor sopranos here singing this high note, let's talk about the psychoacoustic effect. And we've discussed that, sort of touched on that throughout this series whenever I came back to mentioning the staging of this. How the chorus was screened off and in a separate room from the orchestra so that the sound would just sort of seem to come out of nowhere, and the audience would not even know what they were listening to. It would just be a mysterious thing for them. Neptune the mystic, right? So things are outside of the ordinary. They seem supernatural. And it's a really neat trick to play on the audience. But it's going to be a distant sound because of the fact that the chorus is sort of isolated. It's going to be hard to really make everything out distinctly. And that is something that you should think about when you are reading this. Remember that Holst has artificially turned the dial down on these musicians, just like changing the dial on a mixing board by putting them farther away from the orchestra, farther away from the audience, behind a door, right? The door is open, but it still is a narrow aperture through which the sound of the chorus can come through. That said, he really does set things up nicely for his chorus so that they're guided. It really seems a lot of the time that what they're doing is kind of random. Do you know what I mean? So you would expect that they would have to be really, really great singers or really musical singers. And by that, I'm not insulting singers for not being musical, but singers that have a certain degree of musical training that is very theoretical and spends a lot of time with extremely demanding music on an intellectual level and so on, rather than being more music about the emotions. Now, of course, great emotional music requires a keen level of training, okay? But in this case, I'm just talking about the more general chorus. So a more general chorus can do this easily because it's very easy to hear where the G in this E minor chord is coming from, despite all of this exploration here in the double reeds, okay? So this is not all that hard a note to nail, despite all of the distractions that are revolving around that particular pitch. The chorus will just hear the note in the violins, and they will know where to sing it. They'll know where to place it. And they may even be slightly humming it to themselves, and that would be easy to do because nobody can hear them, right? They are just there, right? They'll get it in their heads, and they'll know where to sing it. So now, let's go back and discuss the orchestration of this page. And it's very, very simple. You can see it's essentially the same thing that we saw at the beginning of the last screen, but without tremolo, right? We still have the A flat and the bass, and we've got the same exact voicing here in the violins and violas. But the cellos are freed up so that they can play the beginning of this theme that rises throughout the rest of the oboe family. But yeah, bum, 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 bum. Notice what is being set up here in the tonality, and that is a melodic minor, right? So we've got the raised 7th and raised 6th, and that's really all that is happening here. It sounds really strange because we're not really used to that, and it's being used in a way that feels more modern than it does ancient, but there is a touch of that ancientness to it, isn't there? So we're kind of standing in both worlds here. Once again, the sense of mystery. Now, after the cello has made its little 6-note statement, right on top of it, almost as if this D sharp is leading to it, the bass oboe plays off of it on the very next note higher, which would be an E, right? This is transposing by an octave. So D sharp, E, bum, 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 right? Not at that particular register, but you see what I'm saying. Notice that the recommended substitution is for first bassoon. Holst really wants it to have that double reed sound. And I've actually heard this played with small orchestras that could not get a bass oboe supplying bassoon, and it works beautifully. It can actually be really magical if you have a terrifically great bassoonist. They can make it sound just as mysterious as if it were a bass oboe, except for the fact that it's not bass oboe. So bass oboe is mysterious because we almost never hear it, right? But if we heard it all the time, people would start saying, oh yeah, that's right, that's bass oboe. That's the thing that sounds like saxophone, right? No, of course it doesn't. But that would be like the way that people would start to categorize it in a kind of a brutal way. And then, on the tails of this, D sharp leading to sounding E, right? So this would be just the next note up, sounding E, of course, written up a fifth from that. And as this rises, the second oboe comes in, and where is this? It's under the English horn. So we have a beautiful voice crossing here, with the second oboe providing harmony for the English horn. And notice what the effect of that is. And that is to keep this really extremely nasal, I hate that word nasal, but to keep that extremely vibrant sound of the larger mouthpiece for the reed, the larger reeds in the forefront of everybody's listening, right? So we've got the bass oboe coming up, larger double reed having a fatter sound. Then we've got the English horn picking up from that. And the little second oboe is harmonizing from underneath, and it keeps that English horn sound right in the front. Then the phrase repeats, this time with second oboe taking over, and the English horn coming in underneath. It's a complete reversal of roles here, pitch for pitch. And that lighter sound helps to set up the first oboe coming in, this time harmonizing completely across with all three instruments. The English horn going back to its same position, right, that it started off with, and then the first and second oboe harmonizing on that as it goes up. And that just sort of continues for 3 bars. Notice that when things get up towards the top, Holst throws in a C natural and a D sharp, which just gives us the sound of an A flat chord that can resolve to an E minor chord, right? Really a neat harmonic trick. I mean, not really all that weird, but still pretty cool with these particular timbres, especially as positioned over this big E minor background here. And right in the middle of that, we get our sopranos holding this G above. And once again, conductors, please don't drag here. An example of this would be the Score Plus audio version that I have added to the playlist of these analysis studies. It's a great recording, don't get me wrong, but the conductor starts off at exactly the right tempo, I would say. And then he just starts to pull back here, just slightly, you know? And I just think to myself, oh, those poor singers, it's like it's already long enough. Just try singing along with it when we do this and see how long you can hold that G, all right? Some people have bigger pipes than others. Let's just put it that way. As that G comes in, we have the game being picked up by the horns, which I think is a great complementary contrast to the double reeds. Of course they have a different sound, but there are elements which are similar between both families of instruments. But same exact pitch here, right? Sounding E, F sharp, G. But it's a different kind of gesture, stepping on the toes of one another, first as single notes, and then as series of thirds. Kind of nice, and it really doesn't go anywhere. It's just the same little 3-note line throughout. And we transfer over that whole D sharp, C sharp here to bass flute, actually alto flute. And that's actually a little tough on the alto flute player to really carry that, so it's good that this is doubled by violas. And that works out pretty good. Not really that it's competing, but it's so close to this E right here in the horns that it would be easy to be swamped, or just like you would just never even hear it, and it wouldn't be a significant part of the musical fabric. But that is all just setting up this foreground element here, this beautiful clarinet solo. Now remember, we are using a clarinet, and there has not been a corrected key signature here. So this still is clarinets in A, and it's not a C score, right? So everything that you're reading here is down a minor third. So a lot of the sharps that are implied here are going to just be part of the natural key signature of the clarinet, what they read as a C major scale. So there actually have to be little flat signs supplied for the B flat in order to get a G natural, right? Which is the same note as our sopranos, correct? It's a beautiful solo and very eerie in a calm way, right? It doesn't unsettle you, but it is placed in an unsettling context, right? Because we've got these singers coming from out of nowhere, and everybody's going to be listening to that in the audience, our untrained imaginary audience that first heard this premiered. And I'm sure that the surprise was completely spoiled after that because of all the press that it got, right? People saying, oh my goodness, you've got to hear those singers. We didn't realize, we just thought that it was coming from our own imaginations and so on. People would have really reacted to that trick that Holst played on them and have really played it up in the press and mentioned it all over the place so that the audience would actually be listening for it for the entire concert the next time it was played. So that's the kind of thing that you can only really do once, right? And then it's no longer a surprise. But as the clarinet's solo starts to come to an end, the violins come in and they take the whole C sharp D sharp thing, interpreting as D flat E flat, and they push it into a flat key signature idea, and it sort of relaxes the music. We talked before about the violins in the previous lecture accompanying a group of oboes and really becoming part of their particular texture and then taking over as an upper strings kind of idea from the oboes, really effortlessly. Now we're going to do something similar here with the violins, just adding a gesture that pushes the music towards a new place, and then having the flutes come in as a group, but continuing to hold on to the violin as the top line. And what does this do? It really makes it feel almost as if these flutes are violin-like. So we can have these flutes increase to a duo and then a trio, and the sense of violinness just on the top line is going to carry throughout the sound of all of these very soft flutes. Now, this only really works at these very, very soft dynamics. There are a lot of textural peculiarities and homogeneity and so on that you can get away with at very, very soft dynamics because the instruments have a great deal more timbral control. But this is just such a neat passage here with the flutes in a chorale expression of first this little rising idea reinterpreted in the new key signature along with the violins, turning into another interpretation of this particular line here that was first introduced in the clarinets. Just really a wonderful construction here, both musically and texturally and everything else. Now notice how the little back and forth here of the violas and bass flute has been taken over by English horn and first bassoon. And it just really sounds terrific. It completely blends into the texture because we are using that same mid-range bassoon plus higher flutes kind of idea that works so great together. I actually could have used this as an example of that in my latest orchestration course, which is being a little bit delayed because we're still trying to sort some permissions. And you would really hear that particular thing. So here's your chance to hear that now. Of course, the violins mix it up a little bit and make it even more texturally homogeneous. Notice how the bass flute line is being recommended for first clarinet. And that just underlines what I said before about the clarinet or bass clarinet being a good substitute for this sort of scoring in flutes. If you needed a lower voice for your flutes, and if you really just wanted it to imperceptibly blend together. So let's listen to this page. Listen for all of those things. I just mentioned this before, but of course listen for that. How the bassoons and English horn support from below. How the strings complicate the sound of these flutes. How they help to push the transition forward into a new texture. And of course, listen for those singers. I believe on this particular recording they're very, very soft, and I've actually boosted the level up to 700%, I think, on this recording just to get it to sound louder. I don't know how professionally it was recorded, but it's a youth orchestra and they have limited resources, so they did the best they could, and it's pretty good for what they offer. Listen for how the horns work within this texture below the clarinet solo, and also for the alto flute and violas working underneath. And then, of course, how this line rises from the cellos to bass oboe to English horn over the second oboe at first, and then the two switching, and then turning into a chorale. And I'll see you on the next screen. And now on this page, the texture simplifies even more. And why is that? Why is this so soft and so spare? Basically, it is nothing but flutes and a little bit of harp playing harmonics. And of course, we've got a little bit of tail end of the bassoons and the first violins over there, and we got a little pizzicato and lower harp here, a bassoon note. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But why is this so soft? And that is because the chorus is so distant, right? If this beautiful development that goes on in the chorus were accompanied too strongly, it would be hard to make out what's going on. So really, even though low flutes and harp harmonics are the most delicate of the most delicate, they are just about what you would need for pianissimo chorus singing wordlessly. Really, singers using their voices instrumentally rather than to express a lyric idea. That is the kind of volume that we have got going on here, and Holst knows it, right? So that is the dynamics of this page, speaking structurally. So let's talk about those background elements first, to put the chorus into context. Right here, we've got a simple B fourth on the outside, E above, written in C, and then of course here this is written in G, so that is an actual B. So we've got our B fourth, and then we've got the little falling D sharp to C sharp coming back. And that just continues on for many bars. Once again, the suggested substitute is clarinet. Now this is being completely doubled by the harps. Recall that Holst uses the approach that harpists prefer, and that is, write the note you intend their finger to play, which will sound an octave higher. It's really a shame that Sibelius isn't set up to do that from the very beginning, where you would play the note and you would hear the harmonic an octave higher, and that has really driven harpists crazy. Right? Sibelius designers, if you're listening to this, you should change everything from now on, right? Just go back to that system where the composer plays the note and they hear it an octave higher when they're working with their sound sets, because this is the way that harpists generally want to read this. Otherwise, you have to write harmonics at sounding pitch or something like that. But that's completely unnecessary if it's just written like this. The harpist will assume. And of course, this is written in a beautiful range. Bass clef, harmonics, I feel, are like the best place to write harmonics because they are the most generous sounding. Of course, you wouldn't want to get below the bass clef. That is becoming less and less easy to speak as harmonics. And then, of course, treble clef harmonics are great. They're very delicate, but you get above the treble clef, and they become weirder and weirder and just very unsatisfying, I feel. So this is really the best range. This note here, D sharp and then the C sharp, is doubling exactly the second flute, right? Because it's sounding an octave higher. And these B fourths here in the second harp are doubling what's going on here in the first flute and alto flute, not bass flute. Sorry, Holst. And that's just a perfectly charming accompaniment here. It's just loud enough for the singers to hear what's going on at the very beginning. And then after that, they are probably not going to be able to hear this subtle accompaniment, but the audience will, and it will balance pretty nicely. So it's just a matter of giving the singers a little bit of breathing space here and there. So not only can they recover their breath, but they can also start to hear what's going on in the orchestra a little bit as some of these textures thin out from time to time. So yeah, that sort of works. Then right here at the end, we've got natural as opposed to harmonic. And this is something you would have to indicate, I would say. Or just continue to have the circle over the harmonic notes. But still you should mention that it is natural. Notice that the left hand is still playing these harmonics just in their place, and this E is a fairly low note for the right hand to reach, but it's still manageable. Now this pluck here is just doubling the cello plucking, and that is giving a little bit of extra attack to these long bassoon notes. And that is really the accompaniment for this whole page. Now, let's talk about our double chorus here. And it really is two choruses, and they're not really subsidiary to each other. It's more like the second is echoing somewhat or reacting somewhat to the first chorus. So, first chorus is just the first one that goes. It's not necessarily doing anything that is all that more complicated. I mean, occasionally the line is a little bit more generous from time to time. But, you know, it just really doesn't matter. The players should be just as good as each other in both choruses. And this is all placed really beautifully. It doesn't really go all that high, except for these A's here, and they're all right. You know, an A is okay, wordless A. You're not really going to get a very, very fine pianissimo out of this high A, and that's understood, right? It's just going to be there, and the singer is going to go up to it, and their voice is going to open up a little bit. And then they can bring things down, and you'll notice that too. After these higher phrases, then the phrases that come under will sound softer. And it's not just the piercingness of the pitch, but it's also just the fact that the singer just really has to sing a little bit louder in order to get those higher notes. And the singers that accompany them harmonically from below will just follow that particular slight increase. It's not very big, but we're talking about really fine textures here. So we should be thinking about the finer points. Like I was mentioning on the previous screen, we end up slightly previewing the way that the music is going to go at the very, very end of the piece. Here we've got our slightly tortuously notated chord, and it's rather neat here that the key signature changed to E major supplying all the sharps that we would need, except for the occasional E sharp here and there, and B sharp that we see here at the end. And that's really easy on the singers, just to think in E major. Because really that is what's going on here harmonically, so why not just say it for the players who have got to deal with it. So here we've got our equivalent to a C minor chord. B sharp, D sharp, and F double sharp sounding G, right? And then resolving up to a C sharp minor chord. And it's very similar to what happens at the very end of the piece. Not exactly the same, but kind of cool. And the dovetailing here just makes it seem continuous, going from chorus to chorus. That's a neat effect too. Let's listen to all of that now. So just really listen to your background and foreground elements here. I notice that I'm talking about background and foreground a lot, and that's something that, say, Adler spends a lot of time talking about. That's his big focus. Mine is texture, balance, and function. His is background and foreground elements. But in a piece as textural as this, you really do have to focus on it, because textures are really all about that. When things are put in that really nebulous context like this, you have to think about what psychological distance you want each player to be from the listener, and that is, once again, the mastery of the conductor, how they're able to manipulate that. But yeah, listen for the flutes going together with the harmonics. Low flutes plus harp harmonics sounds fantastic. And how it accompanies these emerging voices, just really beautifully working together and against each other from time to time. And listen for how they sort of quiet down when the music gets a little bit lower, and how the registers somewhat contrast each other dynamically. All right, and I will see you on the next screen. And now for the very last part of this lecture. This is really, really amazing. This beautiful outpouring of texture after that chorus section. It just really billows and flows and emerges and goes up to this little wisping point here. Really lovely scoring here. If we look at the background, and it's kind of all background, we see the A minor chord here, E flat minor sounding down a minor third, enharmonically with this strange chord here that we just described on the previous screen, which is enharmonically equivalent to C minor as well. It's actually a really, really nice dovetailing here of chorus to clarinets. And if it's done right, it can feel seamless. But generally speaking, the average orchestra, you'll just hear the clarinets come in, and it won't really sound all that strange or mysterious, aside from just how mysterious everything else sounds. We have this same thing again of wooden sticks on the timpani, giving over to a cymbal roll with soft sticks that I remarked upon in the previous lecture. And that is underlining, once again, E minor in the bass and C minor above. Notice how the elements are more mixed up this time. We have the C minor triad in clarinets, and then below we have a C minor 6/4 octave chord, and the way that works out is the G on the bottom in bass oboe, this is sounding down an octave, and then down a fifth we get our root of C, and then the E flat third above on oboes. And under that we've got our E fifths inverted in this case in the bassoons, and then the contrabassoon getting the lowest E there, which doubles the cellos. Cellos and double basses, so they could both play this really easily. It's very easy to play this as a double stop on the double basses and on the cellos. This just shivering along below. What I think is cool is how these flowing elements incorporate both C minor and E minor into their tonality. So we've got the G, which is the minor third of E, and then as also the fifth of C minor, right? So that just arcs back and forth. And then we've got this lovely idea here, E flat, G, B, C, right? And that is the incorporation of all of these elements together. And that's also expressed here on Celesta. I mean, it's a cool chord. You could think of it as an augmented chord with a minor sixth on top, or you could think about it simply as an inversion of a C minor major chord, which is the way that I usually think about these things, because the root of E flat is not actually strong in this context. I mean, it's the first note of each group, but I hear the tonality of the C as the top note more than I really notice the tonality of the starting E flat. And then, of course, as we see this unfold and the arpeggios go through the different inversions, we eventually see the root chord revealed here and there and there and so on. It's just more mysterious to start on the minor third. That kind of takes over the texture for a while. You can see it here too in the tremolo strings and mostly in our winds here. Here we've got our C minor chord up an octave, and we've got this low E flat and high C. I think this high C is just really gorgeous up here, especially if it's played soft and controlled. And then we've got our major seventh here, the B, being played as a written E by our alto flute. And then we still have a touch of E at the bottom here, being played by our bass oboe. So that's kind of cool that it's just carrying this. Throughout all of this, the bass clarinet is being proposed as a double for the bass oboe, and it's really not the most ideal sound to be throwing in there, except that everything is just so soft that it wouldn't make a huge amount of difference if you had to substitute bass clarinet, but still you will just not get the same sound when you get to this chord, and it has to be the rock bottom note. It will suggest other overtones in its position here, but it's the best that can be done. I suppose that a bassoon could have been used here, but then there wouldn't be any sense of continuity, right? And this is perfectly fine as a substitute for the bass flute, I feel, the first bassoon. And then here, this is really lovely. We have our E minor major chord, the E fifth with the D sharp on top. And then we have our C minor chord above. Now notice this, that the second violins were climbing up divisi, where it really could have been the first violins on top, but this helps to keep the sound controlled to an extent. Not that it really makes that much of a difference, but Holst ends up with this lovely voice crossing of the seconds over the firsts, and I think that that's really neat. And some people feel that the seconds actually have a different sound than the firsts if they are sitting to the right of the conductor and their violins are pointed away from the audience rather than towards, and so on. I feel that that's really subjective, especially since in a lot of seating now, the seconds are right next to the firsts, and they are one file back from the first to the left of the conductor. But it's still neat to mix it up and to have the seconds on the highest pitches if you've got a good group of seconds. And then the violas are supplying the minor third there with a high E flat, sounding right here in the middle of this C fifth. Yeah, it's really neat. But what the audience is really going to be focusing on are these sort of thrumming flapping like dove-winged harps and the little glittering back and forth of the celesta. That's kind of the last time that we're going to hear elements like this. And this is all just leading towards this final page here. So the chorus has got the chord of C minor set up by the strings in the previous bar, so they're going to know where to come in. And this is neat, once again, dovetailing just like before when the chorus was abandoned a few pages ago, coming right back in on the same kind of idea. This endless dovetailing is also a bit of a magic trick, really. The audience may be wondering, who is singing? How can they just keep singing for so long? There is really a lovely element here, descending in the altos here, and that is doubled by alto flute, just on this one single pitch walking down. Just such great ideas here. And then, this is kind of fun, when it gets to the bottom, it harmonizes instead of just continuing on C sharp, C natural, B. The second altos sing D sharp and then C sharp. So it's just very, very cool. They're setting this up, of course. But you can really hear that alto flute guiding the lower singers all the way through to the end. And it's a lovely effect. And of course, clarinet would be the best thing to double that if it were needed. But this is coming in really the same as before, right? We've got our B fourth expressed here in harmonics by the harp. And we've got our little D sharp to C sharp, sort of rising and falling. And that is doubled by the left hand of the harp. Now notice that we're adding some elements here. One of which is that E that kind of firmed up the harmony before. If you remember at the end of that very long page with the choir soli. So that is coming back in, and it's being played by a very soft first clarinet. Remember, sounding down a minor third, right? That's the same middle of the bass staff E that the bassoon was playing before. So, same exact idea, and then just a couple of little notes on celesta, right? Sort of playing harmony over the top of this chorus. That is also a lovely idea. And just this little tinkly note here, just thrown in there. It's really, really lovely. And then, once again, our rarely glissandoing harps are back to glissandoing and told what to do up in 3, down in 2, going back and forth on different tuning schemes, notice. So A, B sharp, C, D sharp, E flat, and so on. And then A flat, B natural, C sharp, D flat, and so on. And that allows the harps to play over the different vocal chords here. And above all of this, the violins are just gradually playing these little octaves, and notice that they aren't necessarily being doubled by anything else. When they're holding this high B here, they're actually not being doubled by celesta here. The celesta just throws in this little D sharp, C sharp here to kind of echo this as it finishes. And then this bar is to be repeated until the sound is lost in the distance, and that is achieved not only by the singers getting quieter and quieter, but by the choir master very slowly closing the door. Once again, Holst is really trying to figure out a way to bring the mixing board into the orchestra. This is his attempt to organically mix his choir. So put them in an isolated chamber and actually have a physical potentiometer device, right? Which is the door, right? He not only has he got them down in the mix already, now he can close the door on them, which is the same as just pushing the fader down, okay? And I just think that is really cool. That is a look forward into the mixing techniques of the future in a very small way, of course. Now, this is kind of complicated sounding, but it's the sort of thing that once the choir has learned how to do it, they can just continue to do it for the rest of their lives. It has a really beautiful sound and very eerie sound, and it's a great way to end this entire suite. I have shared the anecdote a couple of times of how different orchestra managers and possibly publicity people were asking whether or not they could just put Jupiter last. That way the whole suite could end with a bang and everybody would be happy, and boy, this would be a joyous occasion. And Holst flatly refused. And you can see why. I mean, this piece, to me, has more emotional impact than anything in Jupiter. Sure, Jupiter is jolly and it's obvious and it's boisterous and all that other kind of stuff. Things that work great in finales, and it really does sound like a finale at the end. But really, this piece has so much more impact, and it is so much deeper, really. It forces you to listen. I mean, literally, if you really want to hear what's going on, you have to shut up, and you even have to turn off certain internal things that make noise in your thought processes and prevent you from really focusing and appreciating a piece. And forcing the audience to get into that state at the end of the concert, I feel, results in a much greater emotional response at the end. I think that if Jupiter had been the last piece and had been allowed to be programmed, it would have ruined this suite. Because it's just like the ending of any great piece of music, Daphnis and Chloe, The Rite of Spring, but in such a different way, right? This really has its own aesthetic, and that is something that has been reflected in the work of great composers since. And even in, maybe my own small way, I have found myself coming to this solution just on my own, and maybe remembering later on that it was something that Holst did initially, and that was to end a piece very subtly and yet emotionally demanding. And this has it all. So listen for that. Remember that this is the end of my lecture series on this and the end of a monumental work by a great composer. Think about all those things when you listen along and view these two pages, and listen for all of those things: the dovetailing of the chorus, the very strange and beautiful reach up here to B and occasionally jumping up to C sharp there in the violins. Listen to how that complements what we heard before in terms of the harp harmonics doubling the flutes. Listen for the dissension here of the alto flute and how that is doubled by the lower voices in our chorus. And then on this previous page, listen to the way that the clarinets enter here on this C minor chord, and the way the mass of winds and trombones and percussion come in along with these strings, and how the dove-like wings of the harp sort of flow out of it and are met with this jingling celesta as the chord transfers to the upper winds. It's just really lovely scoring, and I'm so glad that I was able to sit here with you and go over every note of it that I could possibly point out. I think that there are whole worlds in here, and it's not a surprise that this has been the go-to piece for a lot of film composers and directors too, who want to bring a sound into their music, and by using it as temp music or as inspiration have sort of brought along a lot of film composers who might not have written as grandly. And that includes John Williams, by the way, who was faced with this as temp music in the first Star Wars film. So think about all of those things, listen to this, and really, it's been a pleasure and an honor bringing this whole series to you. And I'm just so grateful, and it's just been wonderful. But the experience doesn't end here, because we are going to be going directly to Pictures at an Exhibition by Mussorgsky, as orchestrated by the master himself, Ravel.